Desigualdades. Mi nombre es Ernesto López, yo soy investigador asociado del Centro y se me concedió el honor de presentar este segundo día al profesor Abdoumaliq Simone en su charla magistral del día de hoy. El título de la charla es Recomponiendo la vida urbana colectiva, acerca de operaciones y lo inoperable. Voy a, antes de pasar a la presentación del profesor Simón, quiero decir cómo vamos a funcionar hoy día. Este es un non-stop flight durante el día, sin escalas. Por tanto, vamos a tener, después de la presentación de Abdoumaliq, una pausa de café para poder conversar y hacer un poco de red social. Y luego vamos a tener sesiones durante todo el resto del día, con lo cual no hay horario de almuerzo, no hay pausas, por lo tanto, si es que les da hambrecita o tienen ganas de tomarse un refresquito, recomiendo vayan a la cafetería, se compren su cosa y se metan en las sesiones directamente para que no tengan inconvenientes. Luego terminamos en la tarde a la hora usual. Ahora voy a pasar a la presentación de Abdoumaliq. Primero quiero decir quién es Abdoumaliq Simón y qué hace él. Abdoumaliq es un urbanista en el sentido más amplio de la palabra. Su trabajo se centra en varias dimensiones, expresiones culturales, de gobierno y de planificación, discursos, espacios y tiempos en ciudades de todo el mundo. Es un exponente principal a nivel mundial de urbanismo comparativo. Sus principales publicaciones incluyen In Whose Image, Political Islam and Urban Practices in Sudan, publicado por University of Chicago Press. For the City Yet to Come, Changing Urban Life in Four African Cities, publicado por el Duke University Press. City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, Movements at the Crossroads, publicado por Routledge. Y Jakarta, Drawing the City Near. Ese es el libro más reciente de Abdoumaliq, publicado por Minnesota Press en 2014. Su proyecto actual en el Instituto Max Planck de Alemania, donde Abdoumaliq está adscrito ahora, se titula New Urban World, Emerging Forms of Collective Life in the Global South, que se centra en las nuevas, inspiradoras y perturbadoras también formas de vida cotidiana en zonas metropolitanas de Lagos, Yakarta, Johannesburg y Nueva Delhi. El estudio de estos nuevos mundos urbanos es fundamental, tanto para una reconstrucción de los estudios urbanos como para la formulación de políticas urbanas y sociales más eficaces. Como dije, el título de la presentación de Abdoumaliq es Recomponiendo la vida urbana colectiva, acerca de operaciones y lo inoperable, y voy a leer brevemente el resumen de la presentación en castellano. ¿Cómo se conectan las vidas unas con otras? ¿Qué es lo que quieren o necesitan las personas de todas las diferentes instantaneidades de vida que las rodean? ¿En qué medida es necesario que trayectorias particulares de vida consideren las otras vidas que los acompañan en alrededores más amplios? ¿O simplemente necesitan saber que las formas específicas de hacer las cosas están ahí, en algún lugar, sin tener la necesidad de interactuar con ellas? ¿Cuándo es necesaria la interacción? ¿Cuánto de interacción debe ser reconocido y cuánto debe ser recalibrado? En ciudades donde miles de cosas están sucediendo simultáneamente y en cualquier momento, ¿cómo es que las vidas particulares saben exactamente lo que es relevante para ellas? ¿En qué medida pueden los habitantes rastrear el impacto de sus propias acciones? ¿Y en qué medida y hasta quién deben extenderse cualquier obligación ética? ¿Y en qué forma? Estas son preguntas cruciales para los esfuerzos dirigidos a entender a la gente que reside en distintos ambientes construidos principalmente por ellos y que deben lidiar con el despojo y la resolución de problemas colectivos que se han ido desarrollando en el tiempo. ¿Cómo los residentes de los núcleos urbanos residuales de Yakarta y de muchas otras ciudades en el hemisferio sur lidian con los acertijos involucrados en los intentos de actualizar estas operaciones en medio de múltiples formas de intervención urbana, algunas de las cuales están repletas de opacidades y efectos inciertos? Pero incluso si las intervenciones más opacas parecen inoperables, nunca del todo realizables, aún generan impactos y fricciones imprevistas. Incluso el volumen masivo de proyectos e infraestructura que se realizan terminan a veces promoviendo futuros muy distintos a los que se prometieron. Esta presentación considera lo que puede estar sucediendo en interfaces disruptivas y llenas de tensión, entre lógicas variadas y fuerzas de transformación espacial y operaciones actualizadas de autogestión en el mundo. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todas y todos por venir. Doy la palabra entonces ahora al profesor Abdoumaliq Simone y lo invito a pasar a la testera.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thanks a lot for opportunity to be here. I'm going to talk about the erasure of the city, and not the city of either Augustine or Jane Jacobs, but the city as a locus for what Jacques Rancière might call the implementation of equality. And the erasure of the city as the erasure of a possibility of a certain kind of equality. So what kinds of stories can be told that might enable the capacities of the urban majority to invent anew the conditions of their everyday lives? What kinds of stories can be told about those whose stories end up being expendable, wasted? What might we pay attention to in the very process of storytelling that might enable stories to be heard in a world where there's both a surplus of sensibility and an impoverishment of imagination? A world where larger volumes of data are mobilized instantaneously so as to increase our resilient adaptations to the multiple appearances of realities from all over the place with no clear story to tell. Of course, stories have their infrastructures, a constantly expanding hard wiring of material senses and signs. This is what allows for stories to take shape, to be conveyed. Yet each suture, each hinge and agglomeration applied to make an orderly, sensible narrative in face of the uncertain flows of forces and momentum points to its own insufficiency. Infrastructure is always falling short. It can never fully contain or channel the stories it tells. For from its inception, infrastructure seems to point to the simultaneous presence of many different temporalities. All of the actions never quite constellated as events. All of the intersections and transactions that either could have happened somewhere but didn't, or that did but didn't go anywhere specific, or didn't leave enough of a tangible trace to point back to or to move on from. The very material frame of the story of the city continuously haunts us. Take the histories of Lagos, of Jakarta, of Karachi, for example. When you look at how space, how governance, and the making of jurisdictions were repeatedly contested, when you look at the incessant insufficiencies of resources, it is clear to see how the story of urbanization occurred in the interstices of definitive patterns and definitive authorities. Residents had to constitute themselves. They had to constitute their assets, their livelihood practices, and networks of belonging as ready-made facets of many possible development trajectories or systems of governance. They prepared themselves to be part of many different stories because no overarching narrative prevailed. The components of the urban story, such as land or property, did not exist as stable entities, as single objects over which different institutions and authorities fought over. Rather, land existed as a critical element of those very institutions and authorities, part of their very ability to exist. And as such, land, housing, and water were many different things all at the same time. And what about the characters of stories in urban life today? Urban residents or users are not coherent entities, but shifting fields of probable actions, data sets, risk calculations, credit ratings, genetic profiles, and shifting lifestyles. Urban populations are less defined by stable, differentiated attributes through which relative inequalities can be measured than by the nature of their very convertibility and interoperability. And by interoperability, I mean the capacity of a population to compose and decompose, to become many different things at different times. So when we talk about who are the inhabitants of the city and the rights that are appropriate to those inhabitants, there's a large amount of ambiguity as to who we are talking about and who feels affected and what kinds of senses are at work to perceive what is equitable or what is not. stories that make easy divides, stories between us and them, here and there, what counts or don't count, may continue to be shortcuts providing some kind of orientation. But these divides no longer say much of anything about how places and people are connected to each other, about how we are increasingly subject to datafication that provides a kind of world sensibility that goes beyond all of our consciousness and any particular place. Yet stories are and should be things that we continue to tell. In September 2016, Pasar Rumput was torn to the ground. The market in the central Jakarta district of Manggarai was a warren of beauty salons, often doubling as brothels, seedy nightclubs, cheap shoes and bags, bicycles, fruits and vegetables, under the table almost anything that fell off the truck. Its reputation spread far and wide as a place where anything goes in a city that has become increasingly going in one direction. That is, surfacing the expectations of an enlarging middle class. Ironically, much of this middle class is dependent upon markets like Pasar Rumput to keep their expanding desires for consumption affordable and to have moments of respite from the expectations of social conformity that such middle class status oftentimes installs. Pasar Rumput was especially well known, if not always well regarded, by the largely poor and working class districts that surrounded it. Jakarta's government, in tearing down the market, announced its intention to replace it with 2,000 units of social housing for 8,000 poor residents that had been evicted from a long-standing community on a riverbank not far away. This is part of the government's plan to better control the river in order to mitigate flooding. A new market will be built under the strict authority of the municipal agency that is supposed to manage markets, but hasn't really done a very good job of it in the past. The market is intended to accommodate all of the small-scale trading that the new residents were conducting in the areas surrounding their soon-to-be-demolished homes. Integrated social housing and commercial facilities is a major step forward from the usual practice of consigning the evicted poor to the outskirts of the city in towers that neither provide commercial space or were close to any sufficiently populated areas for hawking, repairing, and fabricating to viably take place. So Pasar Rumput was in many ways a useless place, an eyesore, an affront to the sensibilities of an expanding CBD. But few places in Jakarta generated so many stories. Much of these stories centered on how the surrounding lower and working class districts were really run, about how the shifts in local power, about the behaviors and tastes of local officials. The market was the site of all-night card games where brokers, military guys, favor seekers, and political hacks would come from all over the city, spreading news and gossip and hatching plans. It was a place where prostitutes could be trained to infiltrate opposition political parties, to provoke scandals or blackmail the big shots. It was a place where brokers who provided labor for big construction projects would initially get together to get their stories straight before fanning out to the fancy hotels to meet with the developers. It was a place where teenagers with little money in their pockets could go to get their hair done for almost nothing, and then hang out at the shopping malls, passing for acceptable middle-class kids. It was a place where youth from different neighborhoods riding around the city would meet to organize their itineraries for the night. Pasar Rumput, run down and naughty, was a story-making machine. Stories were built upon, revised, connected, always finding a way to keep going. Now, I'm not suggesting that the story of Pasar Rumput that to keep things as they are represents some kind of integrity or authenticity of a particular way of urban living. The lower classes do not belong to any particular built form, and no particular built form belongs to them. After all, the processes of self-construction that produced much of the urban environment across Asia and Africa occurred incrementally, step by step, without definitive imagination of a specific destination. After all, what would completion look like? Even if those who built their own quarters looked toward concretizing particular dreams or norms of place worthy of them, many would run out of money or motivation. To leave things incomplete was often the wisest thing to do, so as to avoid taxes, leave room to address different contingencies, or bring in others into the production process. What was important was a sense of forward momentum, that the efforts were worth something, not necessarily in monetary terms, but in the ongoing capacity to build relationships with the surrounds, with other inhabitants, human and non-human, relationships that afforded a range of different possibilities for action. When conditions don't seem to be taking you anywhere, where you constantly battle to keep your head above water, and where most of the efforts you make, both individually and part of a larger collective, at best only manage to repair breakdowns of all kinds, then the particular format or mode of living the urban don't really matter. It don't really matter no matter how much it is familiar, no matter how much it embodies cherished memories or attainments. As such, indifference sets in. Inhabitants wait for seemingly inevitable displacements or eagerly jump for opportunities to acquire new assets, new property, new lifestyles if the price is right. What is important, though, is the capacity to keep going. What was so productive about many instances of self-constructed urbanization was the way in which different things that were built could be translated into each other in many different ways. Housing, work, sociability, caretaking, service provisioning, and livelihood were all connected to each other. A house wasn't simply a house. A place of work wasn't simply a workplace. A religious institution wasn't simply a church or a temple or a mosque. A neighbor wasn't simply a neighbor. Water and sanitation and power weren't simply material resources coming out of the blue. They were woven through each other, continuously combined in different ways. In other words, what was important was the capacity to keep telling stories and for stories to lead to other stories, multiple storylines, where inhabitants could see themselves written into the fabric of urban life in various ways. In this way, inhabitants had recourse to concrete examples of different versions of themselves, as well as different versions of what was possible. The character of the self-constructed was a space for many characters, a space where the many could become one, and the one many, in a back-and-forth movement that ensured that there were a sufficient number of different ideas and ways of doing things in circulation. But at the same time, these differences didn't rule out people paying attention to each other, and as a result, making them an integral part of the stories they would weave out of their own lives. So it's not so much a matter that the capacity to tell stories, that the capacity to tell stories requires specific built environments or vernaculars. People can create stories no matter where they are. But my concern is with the tendency of the built environment to be created with the purpose of inhabitants keeping their stories straight. Under the auspices of inclusion, of providing inhabitants with a viable level of affordances, built environments tend to become a one-size-fits-all narrative. Now, I do understand the difficulty in rolling out housing and service provision that is affordable and manageable in order to service the largely underserviced populations of urban Asia and Africa, long accustomed to makeshift infrastructures of all kinds. Intricate regulatory frameworks specifying eligibilities and conditionalities appear to be, in many instances, common sense. You do need to have some rules about who can be where and who gets what kind of thing under what conditions. It is a kind of common sense. Redistribution is difficult in settings that don't have all that much to distribute in the first place, and where demands are so great and the landscape to be governed so messy, there has to be at least the impression that there are devices through which administration can get some kind of handle on things. That is why I spend many days negotiating the wording of documents, cajoling support from government officials for pilot projects and commitments to line items in municipal and national government budgets. Negotiation over the language of accords at any scale may seem to be a kind of tedious and wasteful exercise condemned to fall short. But they are also about a politics of how to tell stories, to provide different kinds of actors with storylines through which they can find pathways to each other. With all the stories cities tell, there needs to be moments when inhabitants of different backgrounds and responsibilities can sift through this plurality of stories and decide which story they're going to tell together to widen the commons which is to be addressed and which in turn will respond in some way. Much of contemporary urban theory indicates that what the urban is and could be is indifferent to any particular instantiation of the urban. As a planetary phenomenon, urbanization is both an intensification of articulation, of connections, and its extension across space. So urbanization takes different forms, extracts different costs. This indifference to showing itself, this indifference of urbanization to show itself in specific formats corresponds to an indifference that cities seem to show to the majority of their inhabitants. Particularly within the global South, cities seem to act surprised that the majority is even still present, still kicking. They are indifferent to their needs while claiming at the same time to be the embodiment of their aspirations. So critical political struggles in the near future will largely be centered on this indifference and the divergent reactions it is likely to provoke. For example, what are the futures of youth who will make up a large percentage of the demographic expansion of Asian and African cities? There will be youth who, in face of this indifference, will be primarily concerned with trying to elicit some kind of recognition, tie their future down, acquire as many assets as they can, or at least pursue trajectories that are likely to guarantee the acquisition of those assets. They will attempt to regularize themselves as much as possible in terms of the prevailing norms of success and security. And perhaps more importantly, attempt to convert as much of their social lives as possible into some form of accumulation. The old neoliberal soft shoe, okay? Then there will be those youth who will appear indifferent to the indifference shown to them. They won't care about the way in which they, in some ways, are treated or not recognized. In other words, they will circulate through as many potential opportunities, places, residences, jobs, and social networks as possible. They will be less concerned with being recognized as contributing members of a particular society and more focused on being ready to seize opportunities to operate somewhere else or as someone else. Of course, these two divergent trajectories are not only matters of volition, but life paths that are also, of course, imposed. For many, the prolongation of youth and the kinds of malleability that comes with it are forced on individuals rather than being a strategic choice. For those who seem to quickly settle into particular regimens and routines, some are encumbered with responsibilities to keep households and kin above water. So the relationships between the voluntary and involuntary, the settled and the unsettled, will likely produce intensely volatile stories. The well-off will run to the hills or gated communities as usual, and many of the poor will simply be wasted and many will simply be caught up in the constant expenditure of energy in order to make ends meet. But there is also a youthful population in most southern cities today that know much more than their predecessors about the ins and outs of the city, who circulate through the city in much more expansive ways, regardless of their backgrounds. So the future population of Asia and Africa will be much more mobile, no matter how many closed borders, no matter how many surveillance systems, or whether or not they actually go anywhere physically or not. They will produce stories, many of which will make empirical validation irrelevant, and cities will remain vast layers of impressions, claims, and dissimulation. Cities will remain places of secrets, of stories always in waiting, stories always waiting to be told. Stories are not clean slates. Too often, municipal officials, urban researchers, and financiers argue for the need of a clean slate. In the recent Habitat 3 process, there were many invocations on the part of mayors, researchers, and planners to get things right, and that the only way to get things right was to start with a clean slate. What they usually meant by this was the systematic extension of the city beyond its conventional, conceptual, and territorial demarcations in order to effectively design the appropriate proportions and affordability of things like public space, transportation, bike lanes, and institutions. While I certainly agree that such expansionary mechanisms are viable trajectories of urban change, it is this notion of clean slate and getting things right that worries me. It worries me in terms of its residual modernist impulses, its repetition of the need to always start again, a starting predicated on eliminating or at least evacuating the stories that came before and their architectural embodiments and residues in built and social environments. It is the abandonment of intersection, the abandonment of figuring out how to splice new forms and ways of doing things onto what already at least tries hard to work. It is the abandonment of a process of recomposing, what the black philosopher Fred Moten has called ensemble work, of how to do different things in concert, even if there is no map that specifies how the ensemble work, how things will fit together. Part of the problem here, again, is one of stories. We always look at the city, whichever version of it we may be using, and think we know what we're looking at. I mean, we tend to look at particular pieces of built environment and say, oh, we know what that is. This is the embodiment of this, or represents this. We think we know the story. But sometimes when things that look as if they diverge, look as if they're separate realities, may at the same time with the story also connect to each other in ways that are not apparent. So take an example from Jakarta and the expanding, enlarging CBD that seems to encroach upon and eviscerate long-standing working-class districts. This sets up what seems to be a troubling interface, full of frictions, unequal power relations, disrupted lives, and cutthroat real estate competition, where developers attempt to offer ever more spectacular experiences. Indeed, a large volume of displacement of existing inhabitants has taken place over the past decade, a process which seems to accelerate as a kind of herd effect that takes place among corporate entities eager to maximize locational value and the purported synergistic effects of many different kinds of services in close proximity to each other. But at the same time, different stories can be told. The uncertain relationships of this interface between, for example, the CBD and the popular neighborhood can become a different kind of epistemology, one where each territory can become a device to discover unattended dimensions inherent in both. For example, within the popular, it is possible to tell stories about the ways in which various constellations of actors and residents themselves operate as holding companies, develop local forms of securitization on land that still has an ambiguous formal status, where it is not clear who exactly owns what. Or more importantly, where tenancy, ownership, and property are not conceived on a plot-by-plot, building-by-building basis, but ownership, tenancy, and property as something that cuts across a patchwork of multiple properties and residencies. One plot of land may be officially registered as another, or several places may be viewed as the property of groups of extended families or local associations. As evictions and displacement frequently take place through picking off one plot at a time, it is important to learn more about how to concretize the use of these practices to develop these popular districts in different ways. There's a story about one area in Jakarta where, you think you walk into the front door and you think you're walking into the person's apartment, but you walk into that front door and the whole block has organized itself. So you walk in the front door, then you take a right, you go all the way down the corridor for the rest of the block, go up a few blocks of stairs, come back in the middle, and there's your apartment. They've made ambiguous the whole block so it's not clear to the outside world who owns what. From the outside, you can't tell. So they've made sure that they don't get picked off one by one by designing the architecture of the block so it's all entangled, so if they're going to be picked off, they have to be picked off as a whole and not one by one. At the same time, these neighborhoods, these popular neighborhoods, can operate as extensions of the CBD. They house and feed thousands of workers, and there are many instances where corporations have been enticed into applying pressure to keep some of these neighborhoods intact since they see the benefits of having a workforce close to work, always available to show up on time, and able to save some of their usually meager salaries. More invisibly, it is also important to demonstrate how the CBD itself acts as an extension of the popular neighborhood. We know that high-rise towers and shopping malls could not function without all of the low-end service workers that keep these machines going. But we know less about all the off-the-record informal businesses and deal-making that takes place amongst them in association with different syndicates and brokers, and the ways in which many of the infrastructure and affordances of these places are used during the night or off hours to support all kinds of so-called illicit economic activities. Additionally, vertical living does not necessarily put an end to the popular district or to the process of auto construction. While prefabrication and large towers indeed do not leave too much room for physical adjustments and incremental additions, the way in which individual apartments may be acquired and occupied and then lived in reflects in many instances a reinvention of collaborative work. In many so-called affordable housing projects, apartments are acquired in blocks. Extended families and associations may occupy an entire floor, and floors initially sold for residential purposes may come to house many different functions. The point in all of these examples here is to productively look at what we think we know for sure, and to use this apparent certainty as an incentive to look once again, and perhaps generate a kind of parallax view, a way of seeing things as both and rather than as either or, and to use the interstices of these views as a way of figuring out how to reinvent valued characteristics of neighborhoods in new formats. Now, to tell stories entails responsibility. People can come up with any kind of story they want. But if it doesn't make an appeal to others, if it doesn't take into consideration their conditions and sensibilities, the story ends up conveying more about the person telling it than having an incitement or pleasure in its own right. Stories attempt to draw lines between a here and a there, a then and a now, as well as imagine future places and time. Part of the problem of urbanization as a process of capitalist reproduction is that the stories that get told in this process tend to abdicate any such responsibility. The city is treated as something that is to be the site of simply willing a new world into existence. The daily routines and sociabilities and aspirations of popular neighborhoods may have contributed to a sense of eventualities. And what I mean by eventualities is where something comes to life that's not planned, where the shape of what comes cannot be foreseen or described in available language. Part of the power of auto construction was not just that it simply built material housing. Part of the power of auto construction was its power to constitute particular eventualities, that there was something about collectives doing this together that produced outcomes that couldn't really be foreseen or anticipated, where no one could control the plot line, that no one could control exactly what was to come about. Yet at times there was a link and knowledge between what people did and how this uncertain, difficult to put into words eventuality turned out. But increasingly, urbanization becomes a vehicle through which capital attempts to consolidate everything that exists in urban space and deploy this consolidation as a means of controlling the very process of eventuality. In other words, capital is less concerned in the profitability of development projects, less interested in getting people to stay put, less interested in developing precise calculations about future scenarios. Rather, capital wants to control a capacity to give rise to eventualities no matter what shape or behavior they might assume. It is as if capital desires to finally fully realize itself as a kind of magic. Here it doesn't matter how stories connect to other stories. It doesn't matter how they connect to those who might be their recipients. In fact, the story here is that recipients simply don't matter. They don't matter in part because, as I pointed out several times, folding everything into the capitalist game generates eventualities that can become incomputable. And the best way for those most powerful at managing the game to position themselves to this situation is to be prepared for anything and not to worry about the interest and identities of those that are affected. Take, for example, the fact that across many urban regions of Africa and Asia, there is a rush to build. And I mean a real rush to build. Politicians, developers, investors, bureaucrats, and ordinary residents seem to talk of little else but the need to build things. From new freeways, transit systems, luxury subsidies, flood canals, to thousands and thousands of small houses and commercial buildings. This is a highly uncertain process, for even if contracts, policies, projects, technical instruments, and brute force hold the constitutive components of roads, rail, household developments, flood mitigation conduits, water reticulation, or sanitation treatment systems in place, each of these components is also enmeshed in a plurality of other relationships and statuses that can throw any project off schedule, can throw any project off the map completely. But also this rush to build instigates a kind of time, a temporality that is set loose from calculation, a process of associating place, people, institutions, finance, and politics that ramifies in unanticipated ways. That is, the very rush to try to make things more certain tends to bring about a process which makes things even more uncertain than they were before. So the search for certainty, this rush to make things, to act now, to try to do something now before it's too late, because there's that window of certainty, ends up producing a kind of atmosphere, a kind of overall environment, urban environment, that in some ways is much less able to be calculable in any way. This instigation can be materialized as the disentangling of landscapes, ecologies, and territories. It can be materialized as the regeneration of places otherwise considered dissolute or beyond repair. It can be materialized as the redemption of past efforts and histories, the realization of long-held aspirations, or the concretization of a possibility of another way of living. So this rush to build is something that goes beyond speculation. It not only operates within the rubrics of financialization of risk as a means of hedging a multiplicity of probable futures for how a specific infrastructure will operate and the value it will have, this instigation also aims to posit infrastructure as detached from reason, within a scenario that cannot be fully calculated now, and which imbues it with an adaptability to futures where no matter what happens, there's a possibility of recouping something which itself cannot be specified now. But of course, stories have no responsibility here to point to a predictable destination. Stories work best when they're full of surprises, unanticipated twists and turns, but the surprises, the instigations of imagination and new ideas works through their ability to connect to those facets of everyday life to which people continue to feel to belong to them. They need not hang on to life's familiarity. They need not hang on to the particular look or feel of their surroundings. But inhabitants want to have a sense of the story as a kind of journey, to feel a movement of passing along through and from recognizable places and things. Of course, storylines must always be drawn. But just what these lines are and how they are to be drawn must take place within a reality of many possible dispensations and waiting. And so therefore, where is the city today? Where does one recoup the city today? And oftentimes, the recuperation of the city today operates in some sense outside of what we do recognize as the city. So for example, a great deal of dynamism, uncertainty, and growth of urban systems today occurs at the so-called periphery. It is here where much contestation and potential inventiveness will transpire. For the expansion of industrial land, often at inflated prices, the relocation of the poor evicted from the urban core and near suburban areas, the rollout of large swathes of so-called affordable housing in various vertical and horizontal forms, and the persistence of agricultural activity, all of these things, all of these features of that periphery sit in an uneasy contiguity, with rarely any clear lines of articulation among them. The disjunctions of these different formats at the periphery are not easily subsumed by conventional spatial development strategies, as their different histories, exigencies, financial substrates, sustainability, and associated political interests all push against each other without clear vernaculars or images of mediation. It is here where maintaining a multiplicity of storylines will be most important, for there are limits to how far urban systems can extend themselves. There's limits to how far populations can be pushed away from existing centers of gravity, and limits about how quickly new centers of gravity can be constituted. Metros can only go so fast and so far. Ecological footprints already exceed sustainable levels, and competing agendas run out of space where the primary strategy for accommodating them is to space them out. Divergences here will have to be part of the same story, a density of stories. And even though urbanization may no longer rely upon density as its defining trope, density of the relationship among stories of all things is the only urban future. Thank you very much.
Tenemos espacio para preguntas y comentarios. Who shoots first? Elvin Wiley y Luis Valenzuela.
Thank you so much. Among many brilliant lines in there was one that I really frantically tried to scribble down. We are subject to datification that goes beyond all of our individual consciousness. It was one when you were talking about interoperability. I was wondering if you could talk more about that and help me understand deeper.
Let's take these two, and then you reply. Yeah. Two, Luis.
There's a radio on here.
So there is a translation. Yes.
No, but there's a radio.
There's a radio. Play music.
It's an advertisement.
This COES radio station. We have one. No, kidding. Good.
My question is in English.
I was going to ask in English.
And you could take off the radio. Thank you for such a wonderful conference. My question goes, if you could go a little bit more profoundly in Global South, as you were challenging that concept in the whole talk, throughout the whole talk. I wish you could phrase it a little bit more or deepen it a little bit more in terms if it is a conceptual framework or operational framework, urbanizational framework, or any other kind of conceptions about this quite intriguing concept of Global South.
I mean, if you look at what's capturing the attention of municipal administrators, it's like the big tech firms like Siemens that makes a huge play in terms of selling analytical governance services to metropolitan governments. Sells the capacity of making interoperable all different kinds of statuses of data that really don't easily translate into each other. But in some ways, the basis of this interoperability derives also from our immersion within multiple facets of social media that in some sense affect us without in some ways being mediated by our ability to interpret what is going on. The search to be able to make decisions and to have impact that's not mediated through, in some sense, maintaining the integrity of the integrity of divergent sectors. That there's something called the transportation sector. That there's something called the water material flow sector or a local government finance sector, that somehow you try to find parameters which make these things talk to each other, but you turn them into something else, and in their aggregate, in some sense, exert a force which we no longer are able to identify because we don't exactly know what that aggregate is. We have no real words for it, but yet in some ways it has an impact on us in some way that in some ways exceeds our ability to mediate it through our own consciousness. There's a book by Mark Hansen, a recent book on Mark Hansen, that takes a look at this notion of a world sensibility, the way in which media increasingly acts upon us in way that affects us in ways that are not mediated through our kinds of conscious interpretation of the world. In terms of Global South, it's more a heuristic, pragmatic kind of vehicle. I mean, one still has to deal and take into consideration the incompletion of the project of decolonization. Of course, decolonization has not taken place, really, and it continues to be a project which needs to find increasingly creative means. But the reference to the incompletion of the decolonization often is used in and of itself as a way to point to a certain kind of singularity that the Global South has, and I think that's insufficient. I think it's insufficient because it doesn't then allow for tracing the kinds of multiple webs of articulation and connection that take place across different kinds of transversals. One of those transversals being south-south kinds of connections, which is a word I don't like very much, but it does point to ways of transmission, ways of circulation that are not necessarily mediated by the kinds of modernist epistemologies that we associate with the North. But these kinds of regional divides to which we attribute particular kinds of ontologies or particular kinds of ways of knowing, I think are not very useful. But there is a kind of pragmatic utility in terms of trying to foster relationships by invoking the notion of the South in some ways, and also recuperating historical circuits of exchange, that oftentimes get occluded when things like policy transmission, resource flow, development kinds of projects are filtered through these notions of, we're coming up with some kind of new regional form. But the notion of an endogenous regionalization has been there for centuries. Why not work with what that is, although occluded or erased as it is?
Paola Girón has a question. Someone else? Matías Garretón has the other one. And then we will have to finish. So these are the two last questions because we have our coffee break now.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned, the way you talk about stories and how these stories get told and how they get mediated into a way of intervening in space. I was wondering, you as an urban planner, and for urban planners in Chile particularly, how would you create a different type of knowledge from these type of stories that could feed into a way of intervening or mediating cities in a different way than we're typically used to intervening or urbanizing? It's about knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very nice presentation, very enlightening. But I just would like to know something more, because you said that capital doesn't care. It just wants to be able to do anything no matter what, in short. But who is capital? Because sometimes we talk about capital, but it's like some conspiracy theory. I don't think that. Yeah. But I'm also interested in being capable to identify who is this capital, what are the mechanisms that allows it to act in this way. So could you be more, do you have some ideas about it to specify what is this kind of force that we don't control but that it's able to change almost anything now? Do you have some more specific ideas about that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's why I would prefer to talk about like capitalist inflected urbanization practices rather than some kind of amorphous notion of capital itself. When I'm giving you that example, I'm talking about a kind of always oscillating relationship between a kind of form of financial brokerage that takes place. These usually mediating between sort of government ministries, developers, contractors, banks, hedge funds, that piece together particular kinds of financial packages for investment. I'm talking particularly in the Southeast Asian context where developers have a great deal of political power. The composition of these kinds of, and they're always very fluid kinds of alliances that are oftentimes discernible only on a kind of project-by-project basis, if at all discernible. I mean, sometimes you really need the services of forensic accountants to try to figure out where the money is coming from and where it's going. But this kind of sensibility that I'm referring to comes largely from sort of talking to some of the major developers within Southeast Asia, in their lack of concern of the profitability of their projects. When they specifically say, we're not interested in whether or not something works now. What we're interested in is controlling the process of being able to make something happen. This is the notion of what consolidation means. You consolidate enough things of volume, the volume able to exert this kind of force. If you do something that doesn't work, well, it doesn't really matter that much. In one of the slides I showed you of that long strip of shop houses that was built on a kind of island outside of Jakarta, no one will ever use that stuff. It will never be used, but it was a move, it was an instrument to make visible a kind of a fuck you, to excuse my language, as part of a kind of conglomerate of ascending actors within the Jakarta environment to say, look at what we're capable of doing right under your noses. We're here. And if you think that's messed up, just think of what we could be able to do. That's in some sense what it would mean. But you're right. Vague instances of refer to. In terms of I mean, what I emphasize so important about markets. I really think that markets are really crucial kinds of arenas about the circulation of stories, because markets become a kind of vehicle through which stories sort of check each other out. They're continuously reformed. They're continuously, I mean, I have a story to tell, but I can tell it and I can wait for it to sort of go around. But in the context of a kind of market as a kind of public space, you can see, you can witness just how much that kind of impression, that kind of story changes. And that's why I think that in some ways, for example, municipalities think that marketing is within their purview. Of course, they're exactly right. Marketing does belong to us. But what they tend to do is to neglect the fact of that the efficacy of these kind of informal, self-constituted markets is not just one that they're very good at providing, but they're very good about how to create a multiplicity of different kinds of realities and possibilities and potentialities for the labor that it is that they do. And oftentimes, planners assemble people, but they assemble them within their own terms, within their own offices, or within a particular kind of agenda, and everyone knows what that agenda is. Everyone knows that in some ways their story has to contribute some way to that agenda. Planners also have to be a kind of invisible force somehow. They have to be able to circulate through different kinds of processes, but not as planners. Wearing different kinds of hats. And how the planner's own working through very different hats, the kind of story he or she tells him or herself about all of those different kinds of engagements that they intentionally try to accumulate in terms of a particular kind of domain or project or urban area.
So we still have so many things to know how to manage with cities, which are growing so fast, and urban population is growing so fast in the world. So it seems the problem is getting bigger and bigger. And your conference brought me the idea that we don't know what capitalism is for. We don't really understand its ultimate goal. Is it for profit, or is it for the transformation of society? That puzzles me, and that's something that really keeps my mind busy. So really, thanks for your wonderful presentation, Abdoumaliq. And we're going to have a coffee now time, so you can exchange ideas with people there.
Thank you,
Muchas
everyone.
gracias
Thanks.
todos por venir, y un aplauso para Abdoumaliq, por favor.